Hello, everyone. This is Luke Johnson from Noetic, the Humanities Teaching app, and I am so graced to be joined by Dr. Jonathan Cook. We're going to be talking about another Melville novel, which has managed to crack probably my top 10 favorite books. I've really enjoyed reading this, even though Dr. Cook warned me that, some people might view it as a little overwrought or a little flowery or this or that, but I thought the writing was absolutely exquisite. We're going to be talking about Herman Melville's Pierre, and I believe it has a subtitle as well, doesn't it?
The Ambiguities, yeah.
Yeah.
Which was a very common thing at the time to write a title and then a subtitle. It was almost the standard way to do titles in the 1850s.
I'm sure we could do a whole audio lesson on the subtitle. I mean, I'm just curious why he, the significance of and the ambiguities. I finished the book by the skin of my teeth in preparation for today's session. So I kind of got lost in the gauzy dreaminess of the writing. I conceptually, there's still a bit of a fog about the text. But, as far as an artistic work goes, this is every bit as good as Moby Dick, at least artistically speaking, don't you think?
Yeah, I do believe that. And there are a few people out there who actually also believe it, although it certainly doesn't get as much attention from readers. Everyone has heard of Moby Dick, and some people read it in college, but only the academic world knows about Pierre. It has gotten a fair amount of criticism in the last 30 or 40 years, and there are people who are becoming more and more convinced that it's a kind of a second masterpiece after Moby Dick.
Oh my God, it's so beautiful. So I don't even know where to begin. So I know kind of the contours. Why don't we just talk about some of the background? Can you tell us how this book came into being? Like, what inspired Melville? Where did it occur to his authorship? Is it based on real life events? What's happening here?
Okay, so Melville finished writing Moby Dick in the late spring of 1851, right? And he had a little free time in the summer. He socialized with some local people. His friend Nathaniel Hawthorne was around, so he saw him as much as possible. But late in the summer, he started thinking about his new book, and there's no real record of exactly when he began it, but sometime in the fall of 1851, which was exactly when Moby Dick was published. October in England, November in America, and but it was also the time that his friend Hawthorne decided he had to leave the Berkshires. He was living in Lenox with his wife and children, and Hawthorne was fed up with the isolation of the Berkshires and the long winter, and he got into a dispute with his landlady, so he headed back to eastern Massachusetts. He ended up eventually living in Concord for a little while before he went to Europe as a consul. So anyway, Melville, this was very upsetting to Melville to lose this great friend of his. But he had to take it in stride. And so there, a lot of people speculate the influence of Hawthorne on the book. There's no doubt that The House of the Seven Gables had some influence on Pierre, because that was the previous novel of Hawthorne's that Melville read. In March of 1851, roughly, he's reading a new Hawthorne novel, which is kind of a Gothic romance, a family history that plays between the events of the 1690s witchcraft trial in Salem and then present Salem, Massachusetts, which is roughly 1849, 1850. So Melville is definitely drawing on that. He's drawing on some elements of Hawthorne personally, possibly, because people say that the character of Plotinus Plinlimmon, the philosopher figure, who was a very distant and kind of detached, objective, overly detached figure who's looking down on Pierre when he writes his novel. People have hypothesized that that may be Hawthorne, who had some very engaging conversations with Hawthorne, but never really committed himself personally, emotionally to his friendship with Hawthorne. I mean, he was always sort of looking out, studying Melville, but also enjoying his conversation with him. So there was always this kind of detachment in Hawthorne that people commented on, that he really couldn't get that close to most people except his immediate family and some of his oldest friends.
I don't know if a lot of literature people know this. I'm sure you do, but just for the record, is that there is an actual philosopher named Plotinus. He was a Neoplatonist.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
I know you. I know you know that, but
Yeah,
I didn't find that out till grad school. I didn't have a. So.
Okay, well, we'll talk
just
about.
Want to let everybody know.
We'll talk about the name in a few minutes, but so Hawthorne. I'm sorry, Melville is. He comes up with this idea of this character who, he's 19 years old. He's an adolescent who thinks that he's going to solve the problems of the world by dealing with this crushing discovery that his father, may have had an illegitimate child. So a lot of this, we'll talk about this too, but this, some of this some of this feeds into Melville's own family history. But the signs that Melville was working on a novel are very scarce in the fall of 1851. There's just the word that he kind of locks himself in his room all morning and then comes out in the afternoon and then goes into town, into Pittsfield, and gets his mail, and has this kind of very solitary existence because he's so hard at work on this book. So, he really wrote very quickly. He was writing in probably November, December, January, February, and there's a definite evidence that he brought the novel to New York City with him in January 1852 to show to his literary friend Everett Dykink. And it turns out Dykink appears to have read it and found it very morally offensive. This is all kind of reading between the lines because we don't have the hard evidence, but it's pretty obvious that something like this happened. Because Melville broke off his friendship with this guy right after that, and he was a subscriber to what was called the Literary World, which was the literary weekly that Dykink edited with his brother, George. And on Valentine's Day, 1852, he sent a letter to Dykink canceling his subscription to the Literary World, kind of performing a sort of a symbolic break with him.
This is so surprising to me. I just have to chime in here for a second.
Yeah.
I don't want to blow the ending, which I know you're going to tell everybody about, but obviously what you're telling me right now, there's some parallels within the novel. But it's surprising to me that anyone, at least just on the first time through, it's hard for me to imagine that someone would find this to be morally objectionable.
Well, you have to realize,
at least compared to other Melville texts, because what it seems like to me is like this seemed to be different from Moby Dick in a lot of ways. I'm hearing a lot of deeply pietistic sort of Christian motives or morals in this text, whereas in like something like Moby Dick, I was hearing a lot of skepticism and questioning and universalism. So at least on the face of it, very superficially, this seems to demonstrate a great deal of biblical scholarship and acumen on Melville's part. Like, I mean, some of the expressions of biblical motifs are absolutely jaw-dropping.
Yeah. Well, here's the major structural comparison to Moby Dick is, Moby Dick is largely a book immersed in the Old Testament. And the metaphysics of God and the creation. Why is there evil in the creation? Well, Pierre is all about the New Testament, and Pierre's name, Pierre, is of course the French word for Peter, right? He was one of the apostles, right? So Peter the apostle. If you read about, in the New Testament, Peter is going to be the rock that the church is founded on, right? So the word rock was a pun on Peter's name. His original Aramaic name was Cephas, right, which means rock, and then somehow his name got changed to Peter, which is the Greek word for rock or stone. So there's a bunch of stone symbolism in the Old and New Testament,
Oh yeah.
as connected with God and then with Christ. Christ is the cornerstone. He's going to of the temple, and
the rolling away of the stone, or the stone being struck by Moses in the desert and giving forth water. All sorts of stones in the Bible.
Yeah, and the stumbling block.
Yes.
That in Peter and Paul is, the fact that he was crucified, the thing that doesn't seem like he's a Messiah, right? This hard fact that you have to accept that he was killed, preventing people from, easily believing in him as a Messiah. So, the figure of Pierre is heavily indebted to all the symbolism of the name Peter in the New Testament.
So where's the moral objection coming from?
Well, the fact is, Pierre, in the book, Pierre Glendenning, which is a Scottish name. In fact, there was a governor of Maryland named Glendenning.
I knew that sounded familiar to me.
Yeah, it's funny. So Pierre, he discovers that his supposed half sister is living in his community, right? And she throws herself on him as to be her protector, right? And so Pierre, he goes through this agony of moral decision making and decides he's going to champion this young woman, and he does it using very clear language from the New Testament, from the Beatitudes, from the Sermon on the Mount. I mean, basically, he's sacrificing himself for this impoverished, emotionally damaged young woman, right? So he's showing his Christian morality by becoming her champion. On the other hand, he's ruining the lives of everyone around him. He's breaking off his engagement to this wonderful young woman and pissing off his mother so that she eventually dies because of this. And then he goes to New York, and he appears to have a sexual relationship with this woman, Isabel, right? Because he realizes that the whole idea of becoming her protector was sort of an idealistic sham, that he was really physically attracted to this young woman and can't help it, that he has to become her lover, So that's why Duyckinck was upset, and that's why when the critics thought this book was insane, because no one, writes about incest
so the issue,
without offending people, right? Even though it was actually this topic was not unusual in romantic literature. German romantic literature had these, incestuous motifs in them. In some of the German romantics, some of the French romantics.
People were still marrying their cousins and stuff, right? Well, I guess what maybe made it particularly abhorrent is to put this biblical language and commingle it with this storyline. Is that maybe it wouldn't have been such an offense if he didn't have these Beatitudes in his mouth at the same time?
Yeah, and he's a very he's supposed to be a very heroic and idealized protagonist. He comes from a wealthy, privileged family with lots of tradition and heritage. He has a revolutionary grandfather who is a hero, and he presents himself as sort of an idealized young man who's supposed to be a likable person, even though he goes through a moral crisis. So the interesting thing, though, about Pierre is by the end of the book, he goes to New York City, and what really happens to him in a religious manner is that he goes from being an avatar or a protagonist with a Christ-like devotion to ethical idealism to being sort of an antichrist when he goes to New York. Because if you read, and the figure of the Antichrist is not very well known among Christians unless you get into sort of crazy evangelical circles. But the Antichrist was a more legitimate, figure. I mean, granted, he was sort of a legendary character who shows up in the New Testament only a few places, but he was sort of the demonic double of Christ, right? And he sort of he was supposed to. I mean, the most extensive comments on the Antichrist come from St. Paul in one of the letters to the Thessalonians. And
I've come a lot of, and with a lot of this apocalyptic literature that I've encountered or whatever, I've heard people talk about there being multiple antichrists and whatnot. But I mean, the most explicit naming of the Antichrist I've seen in Revelation 9:11, where the Antichrist, I believe, is named as Abaddon or Apollyon.
Apollyon. Well, I mean, in other places in the New Testament, I mean, letters of John that says that, there are many antichrists.
Right.
In the book of Revelation, of course, there's the beast from the sea and the land. There are multiple antichrists too. There's the figure of the beast, the number 666, which is a numerical version of Nero's name. I mean, I'm having read a lot about the background of the book of Revelation. I mean, Nero's clearly the tyrant who is the hated figure in that book, who instituted the first persecution of Christians.
Interesting.
So anyway, so the figure of Antichrist is he's an imposter. He pretends he's Christ. He goes to the temple in Jerusalem and starts saying all these outrageous things. So he's really sort of an imposter who tries to trick people into believing him and putting their faith in him.
Yeah, he's going to go into the temple and proclaim himself God, right?
Yeah, exactly. Which you see when Pierre goes to New York. He ends up living in this place called the Apostles, which is based in an old church.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So he's setting himself up to be sort of a counter Messiah when he goes to New York, and he writes this book where he's just sort of letting all of his angry discoveries about moral hypocrisy loose on the world. It's almost like Nietzsche's Antichrist being written a few decades before Nietzsche wrote it, and by an American.
I forgot about that book, and now I got to go back and read that one. I need 10 brains.
Well, one of the interesting comparisons of Nietzsche that and Melville's Pierre is that the idea of Christianity being an unhealthily ascetic religion. The idea that you have to use flesh brushes and starve yourself and punish the body, which is what you see Pierre doing, sort of a martyr to his Messiah instinct there when he's living in the Apostles, and sitting freezing in this room with a desk made of boards on top of a couple of barrels there, and his grandfather's army bed as his where he sleeps. So anyway, but you have to really pay attention to. You have to know a little bit about the background to the religion of the times to make these connections and to know a little about the history of the Antichrist. But the thing that people found offensive is mainly the idea that Christianity somehow was ethically flawed. This idealism that you find in the Sermon on the Mount is just going to kill you in the end, because no one can do what Christ is asking everyone to do. And
the whole point of the Christian gospel is that you're saved by faith and not works. It doesn't matter. I'm just disputing the objection here, because of course everyone's going to fall short of the imitation of Christ. That's why Christ is Christ.
Yeah.
Right. He's there for the atonement.
Right. So yeah, I mean, faith is St. Paul sort of created Christianity, not Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ left a few sayings, and he left a history of a crucifixion, and then other people put together his religion around him. But anyway, so let's get back to some of the other questions. Well, the book was published in the summer of 1852, and Melville couldn't find a publisher in England, so it was only published in New York. And he really did a real number on his career with this novel, because people thought it was crazy. They disliked it. They thought it was overwritten. They thought it was atheistic, and he got some terrible reviews. And one person even claimed that he had gone crazy. It just gives you a kind of a sense of how shallow the literary critical establishment was at the time, especially in this era, because virtually half of the publications at the time were some form of religious book or newspaper or journal or sermon. So a lot of reviewers read the book and thought this was a terrible book for women to read or family reading, because it just challenged so much of people's beliefs in evangelical Christianity, that you can't really conversion is not going to help you, because look at Pierre has a kind of conversion experience when he meets Isabel, right? He has this sort of dark night of the soul when he discovers that his father has had an illegitimate child, and then he realizes, emotionally he works his way through to the idea that he has to make this break with his society, this privileged background of being a young man about to marry a very, another privileged young woman, and he has to sacrifice himself for this impoverished young woman, Isabel, and that will show his devotion to, the ethics of the Sermon on the Mount. So that is, why people found it so offensive, is that it touched a lot of raw nerves in a society that was extremely conscious of its, Protestant value system.
Yeah, I think we've jumped around a lot of the first couple of questions that we were going to kick off this conversation with, but I think there's still some elements that we should address within them. Specifically, I don't have a good schemata for saying, well, this book is this type of genre and this book is that type of genre, because I come from a philosopher's background. It's all like kind of fiction to me, and it's all kind of amazing, and like there's a sense of wonder that I always have for any book that I read. But I guess I'm told, because I have gravitated towards your interests in Hawthorne and Melville or whatever, and the similarities with Kierkegaard. I guess I like. Are we still in the realm of romanticism?
Romance, yeah. Well, you would call this book a romance, and you could call it a Gothic romance. You could call it a sentimental romance. It also is a very sensational romance, and so those were all standard forms for the era. I mean, this kind of writing was very common at the time. The 1850s, women had a huge stake in the literature market. Some of the big bestsellers of the time were all women writing in the 1850s, like Susan Warner, Wide Wide World, Harry Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin. So some of the first bestsellers in American literature were in the 1850s in the genre of romance, sentimental Gothic romance, which meant that these were not, newsworthy stories. They were sort of flowery tales with idealized heroes and heroines, usually with a Christian moral message to them. And a lot of them were geared towards a female readership, you know. So in other respects, you could call this a Bildungsroman, which is the German word for a novel of formation.
Yeah, coming of age.
Coming of age story, right? So it's a coming of age of a young man, you know, who leaves his home, who undergoes a moral education, who has a mentor in this guy Plotinus Plinlimmon, and has an attempt to integrate himself professionally into the city, you know, and he has a sort of a bad angel and a good angel around him in terms of female companionship. These are all standard elements of the Bildungsroman. It also purports to be a Shakespearean tragedy and a Greek tragedy as well.
So
Shakespearean elements, obviously, you know, you see Hamlet there, you see Romeo and Juliet in there, you see some of Timon of Athens when he gets so outraged by the way he's being treated in New York City. So you gotta, as typical of Melville, he's trying to incorporate a lot of literary influences, but Shakespeare, of course, is one of the dominant ones, and also Dante, of course. You know, he's got a lot of allusions to the Inferno, and you know, the discovery of the evil in the world is very much tied in with the experience of Dante in the Inferno. So those are pretty much the three main literary generic elements, you know, the romance, the Bildungsroman, and then the Shakespearean or the Greek tragedy, because there's an interesting comparison with some Euripides, you know, Orestes and Electra, Orestes killing his mother, you know,
right.
So those are the three main generic elements, but of course you got a ton of other literary influences coming in all kinds of places. You know, Milton, of course, is an important influence on all of Melville, and Hawthorne, of course. You know, I mentioned The House of Seven Gables. Hawthorne had, you know, Melville had read most of Hawthorne's work at this point, and so you see other traces of that influence.
We mentioned earlier the fallout that he had with his publisher and how that may have affected some of the elements of the novel. Were there any other autobiographical events that should be noted?
Yeah, well, you know, Melville, his fiction generally is semi-autobiographical, a lot of it, not all of it, but this book in particular tied in with Melville's life, because when he talks about Pierre's living in a beautiful estate in Saddle Meadows, he's really recreating the beautiful house, it's called Broad Hall later on, but at his uncle Thomas's house in Pittsfield. It's a beautiful house with a large farm around it, and it's now the headquarters of the Pittsfield Country Club. You can actually go in the house. They renovated and expanded it. But Melville used this as the setting for the story of this privileged young man's Pierre Glendinning. And the idea of the father having an illegitimate child, well, that sent some scholars on a wild goose chase to try to find something comparable in Melville's father's life. And at one point they thought maybe he had an illegitimate child because a letter turned up about a woman going to Melville's grandfather's house trying to get some money from the estate, allegedly to give to this, you know, woman who had, you know, was the daughter, potentially the daughter of Melville's father. Well, this is all turned out to be totally untrue. The real source of the ethical flaw of the father for Melville was his father's financial um, irregularities, and the fact that he went bankrupt and then he misled um, his uncle, borrowing money from him, getting money from his own father, and dying pretty much, uh, leaving the family in a terrible hole financially, because his father was a businessman, but he was spending much more money than he was making, and he did some shady deals. I mean, he wasn't obviously dishonest, but he was not. He was a little bit cutting corners a lot of the time and misrepresenting things. So I think that is the ethical flaw of the father for Melville. It wasn't a sexual sin like it is in the book. But the fact is that Melville had a cousin, his Uncle Thomas, who lived in Pittsfield, married a French woman when he lived in Paris, brought her back, she died. Then he married another woman. Well, he had many, many children. One of the children was a woman who lived in Pittsfield, her name was Priscilla, and she was, a bit older than Isabel would have been, but she had a kind of sad life, living in Pittsfield, just barely surviving. Her father died in the 1840s, and Melville, I think, he used this young woman as a sort of biographical model for Isabel, even though there was no immoral connection between Melville himself and his cousin. But he was just he knew her from living in Pittsfield as a sort of young woman who was unmarried and struggled to make a living as a seamstress, and so that is another model. And of course, Melville himself, lived in New York City when he was born there, and then he lived there after he was married for 3 years. So he knew what it was like to live in the city and how many poor and desperate people there were in New York City and Manhattan.
Well, that makes sense. I did a lesson on Bartleby the Scrivener before, and I imagine that plays into that story as well.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing is, and something I've thought about, is was there an actual model for Plotinus Plinlimmon? He talks about sort of the bohemian crowd that Pierre lives with downtown at the Church of the Apostles, and it would be interesting to know if there was anyone particular he was thinking of for either Pierre Plinlimmon or some of the other types who lived in that little community of artists and intellectuals.
Definitely. Well, something you mentioned earlier was you talked about how Moby Dick had a lot of Old Testament influence. We have a lot more New Testament influence here, but something we didn't talk about was sort of Melville's own religious pilgrimage between these two texts, how they correlate. So I'm sort of unfamiliar with the different religious cycles in Melville's life. At what point did he reach his conclusions, and when they changed, and do we see any sort of transformation with this text right here? Are we catching him molting in any way?
Well, I think by this point, I would say roughly from Moby Dick to The Confidence Man, 1851 to 1857, you see Melville firmly ensconced in a sort of skeptical mindset. He's still immersed in Christian ethics, right? They're too deeply rooted in his nature to change, but it's clear that he doesn't really have any strong beliefs, and he's given up, as he told Hawthorne in 1856. He thought he would be annihilated when he died. In other words, he had no belief in spiritual immortality. So he'd given up some of the key doctrinal, dogmatic elements of Christianity, but he still kind of firmly adhered to the ethical side of Christianity. So there was
was there a particular event that precipitated that loss of faith for him?
I think it was just looking at how his society in this very hyper-Christian phase was just totally hypocritical. You know, was not acting out all the precepts of the New Testament. You know, you know, you had all this misery in New York City. You had thousands of prostitutes on the streets. You had children begging from door to door. You had you know, terrible suffering of people. You had slavery. You had unethical wars like the Mexican War, and
nothing new under the sun.
Nothing new under the sun. Take care of. So I think it was just a kind of maturation of a natural intellectual need to explain the world. I mean, you know, the classical scenario is the war of the head and the heart, because in Victorian England, this was like a constant theme of writers in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, right? They grew up as Christians. They want to believe it. They buy into it emotionally. They love the ceremony. They love the ritualism. They like to listen to sermons. But on the other hand, they can't believe in the main doctrines that support the Christian faith, like spiritual immortality, like, you know, the resurrection of Christ, even belief in a transcendent God. You know, this is they've shed this belief because they firmly are wedded to, you know, a historical, scientific view of the world. I mean, they can't just put their faith in the New Testament and believe the miracles there, right? That was one of the big things, you know, miracle controversy at the time. And of course, the Bible, the New Testament, is being historicized, so they're knowing more and more about the historical context of the Testaments, the Gospels, how, you know, the Gospels were put together by these faith communities. None of the Gospel writers knew Christ. St. Paul did not know Christ. So all of this is causing them, writers and intellectuals, to step back and you know, they have one of two choices. One is that they feel a sense of relief that they don't have to believe in this anymore. You know, it's kind of shedding of a superfluous thing they're carrying around that makes them feel better, or they feel regret. They somehow have to go back and sort of agonize over how they can't believe and wishing to believe and trying to explain things over and over again. So that's, I think Melville is one of those people who, you know, regretted his loss of faith because he constantly went back to re-examine. You know, all his books are infused with biblical references and religious themes. And if you read all his fiction of the 1850s, you just find all of this biblical symbolism all over the place. And he's kind of like James Joyce. If you read the Dubliners, you know, every sentence of the Dubliners, you can make some kind of symbolic connection. Oh, yeah. But, you know, of course, Joyce was a non-believer, but he was so invested in the sort of ritualism and aesthetic beauty of the church and whatnot. And I think Melville had some of that as well. Plus, you know, his ancestors were ministers. You know, his ancestors going back into Scotland were all ministers in the Presbyterian Church. So he had a long line of people in his family, his father's family, who belonged to the Presbyterian faith. And his grandfather actually went to Princeton to train as a minister, but then gave it up to be a businessman back in Boston. Of course, his own, Melville's father, was a Unitarian, the son of his grandfather.
So Pierre, I guess, so falls somewhere in between this falling away that is talked about between Moby Dick and the Confidence Man.
Yeah, yeah, loss of faith. I mean, the Confidence Man obviously is a bitter satire about the unworkability of Christianity. This is another sort of, it has satirical elements in it about the literary scene in New York, you know, that chapter about Pierre as a young author. But the whole point is to interrogate the New Testament and say, can we really believe in this, you know, and we want to believe in it. Emotionally, we believe in it, but if we actually invest our moral lives in this, it's gonna ruin us. It's gonna screw us over. So there's a profound ambivalence about what he's doing in the book, you know, because Pierre, I think Melville identified with his character Pierre and his desire to save the world, you know, and to be a hero and to fight the good fight and protect his sister like a knight, you know. But he's overcompensating, and it's interesting because, you know, he had this revolutionary grandfather, and the attic at his house is filled with all these clothes of his grandfather. He was like 6'4", right? Pierre puts on his clothes. It's too big. His sword is too big, you know. So he has this psychological need to overcompensate for the fact that he's not living in the heroic generation of the revolutionary founders, you know. He's living in the world, I think, roughly about 1840, 2 generations later. And that is a profoundly important fact in the book, because it's like he's trying to do something in heroic in a non-heroic world.
Yeah, I think about those things a lot too, personally.
Well, I think people get that if they have some ancestor, you know, they have to live up to. I mean, depends on your family tradition.
Yeah. It's interesting where that comes from. Moving on.
Yeah.
So we've got these 2 settings in the novel: Saddle Meadows and New York City. So how do they figure into the structure of the narrative?
Well, the novel is pretty much divided between the two. I mean, I guess there's a little more about Saddle Meadows, but it's obviously a symbol of the Edenic world that Pierre grows up in, right? And, you know, he discovers evil there. The letter that tells about the existence of Isabel Banford brings existence into his world. You know, this is kind of like the presence of the serpent. So, you know, Saddle Meadows is an imagined Eden, but then Pierre discovers it as a fallen world, and he has to leave it. He can't stay there anymore, because he's going to become the champion of his half-sister Isabel, whom he's going to take to New York City with him to make a living on his own. He's going to forsake his fiancée Lucy, and he's going to throw his whole personal life into a turmoil, because, you know, when he gets to New York, he wants to stay with his cousin Glenn Stanley, who has a little comfortable little apartment there. And when he gets to the place or house, the place is locked. And when he tries to find his cousin Glenn, his cousin pretends that he doesn't know him, because Glenn has found out that Pierre has forsaken Lucy Tartan as his fiancée. And it turns out Glenn kind of had a little crush on Lucy, so he thinks by being mean to Pierre, he's doing a good turn to Lucy by showing what a bad, you know, crappy guy that Pierre is. So, but anyway, so Pierre in the city is living in a kind of an inferno, you know, and Dante's Inferno is an obvious model here, because everything that happens to him is just, you know, incredibly painful and difficult, and you know, it's a realm of physical and emotional, psychological suffering. You know, he goes stays in a room where he doesn't have any heat. He's living with his half-sister. Shortly after he arrives, he realizes that he really is physically attracted to her. It's pretty clear that they have sex together, although Melville couldn't really write that into the book. So then he's living there with his half-sister and trying to make money and trying to, he's facing the consequences of being hated by his fiance's family, his fiance's mother and her brother, who come down. Actually, this freakish thing happens in that Lucy, after a while, she goes, when Pierre tells her that he's breaking off the engagement, she has, a terrible fainting fit and gets sick for months after that. But she eventually comes down to live with Pierre and Isabel because she thinks Pierre has done some heroic thing to save this young woman, Isabel, from poverty, right? She's identifying with his ethical idealism. So she's being kind of a female Christ out of this contagious influence of Pierre as being the sort of male imitation of Christ, right? Lucy does not know, of course, that Isabel is Pierre's half-sister, right? That's completely unknown at this point. So Pierre is living in this apartment with these two women. He has to find a way to support himself. He tries to be a writer. He sends a novel off to his publishers. They send it back saying that, it's a terrible work of dastardly pretension, irreligious.
And they're going to go after him legally.
They're going to go after him, leave him. Yeah, I love the name. Steel, Flint, and Asbestos, right? That's the publisher, right? So they are not going to give him a break, because they think that they've been, misled and manipulated by him, bamboozled by a book that is blasphemous, a blasphemous rhapsody, like Voltaire or Lucien. They're talking about.
Was it who are the ones they hate so much? Voltaire, is it Rousseau they hate?
Well,
those are often mentioned in the same breath.
Yeah.
Voltaire and Rousseau, I believe.
Well, they also mentioned Lucian, the Greek satirist Lucian, who
wrote
a book of the Dialogue of the Dead. He wrote satires about the Greek gods. So anyway, so the image of New York is clearly steeped in allusions to Dante, and it's also the realm where Pierre's idealism turns into bitterness against the world, and this whole sort of aura of being the Antichrist sort of seeps into the novel because he's living in a former church, just like the Antichrist is going to go to a temple and preach blasphemies, and he's going to attract silly women, that's in the New Testament, who are going to be convinced by his slick salesmanship. So, and of course, this eventuates in tragedy when Pierre goes out and shoots his cousin after being horsewhipped in the street of New York City because of his cousin wrote a letter saying he's a liar and imposter, right? So he's taking out his personal revenge on his cousin, right? He's a non-Christ because, of course, you're supposed to forgive your injuries, but he's not turning the other cheek. He's going out and killing the person who is the last person in his bloodline, his cousin Glenn, and of course he brings down Isabel and Lucy with him, right? Because Isabel drinks poison, Pierre drinks the poison. It's a Romeo and Juliet theme, and then Lucy dies of kind of shock when she discovers that Isabel is Pierre's cousin, right? I mean, his half-sister, sorry. So the ending is very much, Romeo and Juliet, but in a melodramatic, not so much tragic way. But So those are the two poles of the novel, and so like Moby Dick, like a lot of his other fiction, the book is really about the discovery of evil and how you deal with that, how you react to it, if you fight against it, if you try to tolerate it, live with it. Because Pierre is, fighting the evil, the moral evil of his father's illegitimate child by becoming the champion of the daughter, right? And he's kind of forgiving his father of his moral dereliction by taking on the burden. Like Christ, he's taking on the atoning for his father's sin of infidelity by becoming the protector of the illegitimate daughter.
So I can understand the uprising. I have a better sense of how publishers receive this work and a lot of the concepts that were going on in this that allowed for a lot of protestations. But the thing I don't really understand is how anyone could object to the writing style this is done. Just stylistically,
Yeah.
I mean, couldn't people set that aside and just enjoy it as a wonderful work of art? Or what are the protests against the style?
Well,
I guess the question is, why do we like it so much? What was wrong with them? What's right with us? What's wrong with us? What was right with them? I'm trying to understand.
Well,
why,
I think.
Yeah, what's going on there?
I think Melville was, he was trying to rival Shakespeare. So there was a certain inventiveness in his style. He invented actually a few words in that book. Of course, they're not used like Shakespeare. We've adopted many of his usages. But I just think he was trying to be as poetic and as sublime as possible with language. I mean, he was pushing the limit in terms of his expression, just like he was sort of pushing the limit on what you could say about being a critic of Christianity. And the other thing, though, is people think maybe he was parodying some of the high-flown language of the romances of the time. It's hard to know. In the beginning of the book, particularly when he's living in Saddle Meadow and he's courting Lucy Tartan, some of his speeches to her and some of the narrator's comments on their romantic relationship are incredibly flowery. I mean, literally flowery. And, some of that, I think, reflects the romantic tonality of some of these female authored books of the time, of Susan Warner, and some of the other bestsellers of the 1850s. And so I suppose there is an element of parody, but on the other hand, I think there's just an emotional pressure that Melville was feeling that comes through in the book. I mean, there's incredible sincerity and intensity. As
People
though
find that audacious. Do they take issue with him trying to imitate such masters? Do they feel like he wasn't worthy or something, or that they should be?
Well,
that
I think it was a combination of the style and the subject. The obvious attempt to show the flaws of Christian idealism tied in with the sort of pseudo-Shakespearean language that they thought was over elaborate. For Melville, I think he was just really, kind of embracing a sort of pioneering stylistic extravagance. Because, I mean, if you read some of his other short fiction in the 1850s, there is a real incredible richness of language there. I mean, just amazing use of words. And, I mean, it's not as though he's using all kinds of difficult, unusual words, but he's using language in a way that is very elaborate and aesthetically challenging and poetic as well, because of course his later career as a writer was as a poet after 1859. So he's verging on poetry in a lot of his fiction, throughout his career, but particularly in this book.
I believe there's even some moments of singing in this, aren't there?
Singing?
I thought so. I thought there were a few lines where there was some singing.
Well, who was singing?
I don't remember. I don't remember. Maybe it was just...
oh, yeah, Isabel, right. She's singing with her guitar. Yeah, exactly.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
She's singing about herself, the song about Isabel. And her, she herself, her guitar is sort of an embodiment of herself, because there's a little label in the guitar that says Isabel on it. She's leaning over it with her hair hanging over it. And she's going into this kind of trance state. And, the guitar, of course, belonged to her mother, apparently. So, and that's part of the seduction of Pierre, in that, he not only sympathizes with her suffering, but he just falls in love with this incredible, mysterious, dark-haired woman who plays music, and sings with her guitar.
Do we know enough now to maybe go back and comment on the nature of the subtitle of the book, Pierre, or the ambiguities? I mean, how does
the ambiguity? I think, the main ambiguity is ethical. I mean, the fact that Pierre does something heroic and good, and it turns out to be the ruin of everyone around it. So
right.
How can anything good be evil in the end? What's the problem there? So, and the fact is, is Pierre married to? He pretends that he's married to Isabel when he really isn't. The ambiguity of the relationship between him and his mother, Mary. He's got a mother named Mary. I think that isn't a giveaway. She treats him as though he's her boyfriend and her son. They have a kind of courtly relationship. So all of the relationships have a sort of ambiguity about them. So I think that's where it comes from. And what is really, when I was thinking about the book today, the first thing I was thinking of in terms of these family relationships is the world of Eugene O'Neill. So much of his drama, his plays, very steeped in the sort of Freudian mindset. But
which ones in particular? I'm not familiar with his work.
Well, O'Neill.
I don't know that
really anything in the 1920s and 30s. Morning Comes Electra, or Long Day's Journey to Night. All of these intense family dramas with lots of Freudian sub-themes.
I see.
And a Christian framework for them. So, there's a lot of sort of spiritual kinship between them. O'Neill, I don't think, knew Melville very well, if at all. So the what was our last topic?
Well, let me check here. Well, I think we were just talking about the subtitle and how that we could answer that question a little bit better now. I don't know. You've talked a good bit about Isabel and Lucy and Pierre. I don't know if you want to say any more about Plotinus.
Let's talk about Plotinus Plinlimmon.
Yeah.
Because I'm wondering, what did you think of that character? He wrote this pamphlet called AEI, which is it's taken from an essay of Plutarch about what is inscribed at the Oracle of Delphi, right? The inscription means if. So there's another ambiguity, because he finds this shred of a lecture by Plotinus Plinlimmon when he's going to New York City in a stagecoach, right? because there was no train service yet at that point. And he reads this pamphlet, about chronometricals and orologicals, and
Oh yeah.
it's all about the fact that, how to reconcile Christ's teachings when Christ belongs to a chronological world, and that means that it's one moral principle versus, it's basically absolute versus relative morality. How do you institute an absolute system of morality when everything in the world is different? People, different time zones, different cultures, different attitudes, different situations. And Plotinus Plinlimmon, his ultimate message is that you have to just find the golden mean. Be reasonable. Don't, be generous, but don't overdo it. In other words, don't be like Christ in the Sermon on the Mount, but just try to do a few things that are nice to people, right? And so this is the message of this philosopher who's looking down on Pierre, across the air shaft from him. And Pierre never really meets him, but he sees him around the Church of the Apostles. So he's kind of like a presiding genius of the text, because Pierre is acting out this fantasy of ethical idealism, acting out the Sermon on the Mount. And then when he lives in New York, there's a guy who's written a pamphlet who says that you can't do this. It's going to, run you into unique follies. And you really just have to be reasonable, golden mean, embrace the Aristotelian idea of finding the balance between, virtues. But he ends up being a kind of personally repellent character, because the more Pierre knows about him, the more unappealing the guy becomes. Because he's a kind of a confidence artist. He has all these followers, but he doesn't really interact with his followers. He tells people not to drink, but he himself drinks. He doesn't read books. He just sits there. So he's living in a kind of bubble away from the world, and it seems as though he's not really very compassionate towards people. And that enables him to write the kind of morally balanced kind of pamphlet that Pierre has read. So as a philosopher, what were your thoughts when you were reading this guy's work and hearing about him?
Well, I mean, man, it's so hard because I have 3 books going at once right now in terms of what I'm learning and teaching. I have the Bible, this, and Kierkegaard's Works of Love.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it's hard to know what my own thoughts are, and sometimes it's hard to know which book I'm reading at the time, to be honest.
Well,
I'll say this. I want to say this about this whole middle road, golden mean path, or whatever. I'm very okay with Christian morality shipwrecking on worldly folly. I think there is something imprisoning about the commandments of Christ to love God and love the neighbor, and there isn't really a lot of rational calculation in it. I think they're just sort of like the wise discernment of the Holy Spirit that allows us to perfectly love individuals as we encounter them on a case-by-case basis. So I wouldn't, I would be one of those people that would be okay with looking stupid in the eyes of the world.
Yeah.
But philosophically, yeah, that sounds like a pretty good idea. From a temporal perspective, from an eternal perspective, it's laziness, I think, maybe. But again, it's just a matter of when you're catching me between what book right now.
So one of the things that, people have thought is maybe this is a version of Emerson, who was the big lecturer at the time. Melville heard him in Boston in 1849, and he'd read a lot of Emerson by this time, 1851, 1852. I tend to think there's a touch of Emerson in him. There's a touch of Hawthorne in him. but there might be some other influences out there. Of course, the name, Plotinus maybe ties into Emerson because Plotinus was this super, Neoplatonist of the third century.
And Emerson was messing around with the transcendentalism, right?
Yeah, he was a champion of Plato, and Plinlimmon, of course, is the highest mountain in Wales.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so there's sort of an oracular quality to this guy that ties in with the idea of the ancient philosopher and the mountain, as though it's it's like Mount Olympus or something like that.
Oh, interesting. I wish I knew it's interesting. It sounds what you're saying about Plotinus Plinlimmon's ethical treatises are Aristotelian. I don't know my Platonic ethics well enough.
Well, I'm just saying that's a little bit in the background there.
Yeah.
But the whole point of the pamphlet is to leave Pierre hanging because he only has a part of it, and it's one of a series of many, many lectures that he reads, and then he can't find it. He's trying to reread it, and it turns out it fell into a hole in his jacket, and it's been sitting there all along, but he doesn't know where it went. So the whole idea is that he's exposed to potential teaching that might negate his idealism, but he doesn't really follow up on it because it would be too painful for him to think what he's doing is crazy or folly. He can't face the cognitive dissonance of people telling him he's made a tragic mistake. Although he does at the end of the book, he has this moment when he starts to think maybe Isabel has been an imposter, right? Maybe she's told him a story that is totally false, right? So that because he goes to an art gallery and there's a picture of the head of a young man, and Isabel goes over and says, "Oh, that's my father," it's him. And Isabel, Pierre thinks, how do we know who the father is? How come how do I know that she's not making up this whole thing? So he has a kind of doubts about his mission. Shortly after that is when everything goes to hell, he's put in prison for murdering his cousin.
So tell me this: how would you compare? Aside from if Moby Dick is Melville's Old Testament and Pierre is the New Testament, how else would you compare these? And how would you compare Ahab and Pierre? By the way, I went and I recorded and read all of First Kings after you told me that Ahab was a figure.
Yeah.
In Kings, and he was in a great state of apostasy. He was he's actually a pretty big figure in First Kings. He was a bad dude.
He's a bad dude, yeah. Although not bad for marrying a foreign queen, Jezebel, but bad for taking someone's vineyard away, Naboth's vineyard. Bad for not listening to Elijah, and being hubris is obviously his major sin. I
believe I'm picking up a little bit of Ahab and Jeremiah as well as I'm reading through that now too. I think there's still some reference to him. But yes, back to the question of comparing and contrasting Moby Dick and Pierre and Ahab and Pierre.
The one is obviously sea versus land difference, Old Testament versus New Testament, old man versus young man, shared sense of having to deal with evil, natural evil in Moby Dick, this whale that seemed to be a malicious agent of a mysterious deity, and then moral evil in Pierre, the fact that his father had an illegitimate child and then neglected her, and then the callousness of his mother towards someone like Isabel, the failings of the church represented by the Reverend Falsgrave, this wonderful minister, who goes to breakfast at the Glendenning house in the beginning of the book, and Pierre presents the case about having an illegitimate sister, something like this, and he talks about the woman taken in adultery, and he does this all hypothetically to see what the minister would say about all of these cases, and the minister turns out to be just as conventionally hesitant to embrace the suffering illegitimate daughter or the suffering young woman who has gotten pregnant out of wedlock. In other words, he's stuck on the sort of Victorian moralities of the church that is supported by Pierre's mother, Mary Glendenning, because she's like a rich woman, and she obviously, patronizes her local church, which, by the way, I'm pretty sure is an Episcopalian church, because that was the church of the wealthy people in the Hudson Valley.
Yeah.
And this is obviously an estate, an old patroon estate in the Hudson Valley, maybe up in Rensselaer County or Columbia County in New York State. Those are the areas that are probably likely to be the site of Saddle Meadows, or around Pittsfield, which is just across the line from New York State. And Pierre also is a crusader who wants to strike through the mask. There's some shared language there. He wants to break through conventional morality and solve a moral quandary, which is the fact that this young woman, Isabel, has been forsaken by the world. He's kind of trying to rectify the moral deficits of his world, and it ends with a tragic finale of everyone associated with him going down with him, just like the Pequod in the end, except it's a jail cell in the Tombs in Lower Manhattan. Those are some of the comparisons between the two.
Well, I guess just to bring it to a close, and this is, I've really loved this session. I mean, just for, if no one else listens to it, I mean, I just appreciate the fact that you've clarified so many concepts for me personally. Yeah. But, we've spoken a great deal about how this is quite a controversial work, overlooked, but, controversy can sometimes be good. I mean, no such thing as bad press, or right? Is that the expression? No such. So did this in any way advance Melville's career? I mean, or did this?
No, it was a real setback, because he, Moby Dick, he thought was going to be, he was hoping it would be a bestseller, and I think he knew it was a masterpiece. But of course, the book got mixed reviews and didn't sell very well. Compared to 100,000 copies or 200,000 copies of some of these domestic novelists of the time, he was selling like 1,000 or 2,000 copies, which he could not live on. So he was very upset by the reception of Moby Dick, particularly his friend Everett Dykink's review of the book, which, some of it was positive, but then a lot of it was complaining about Melville's attacks on religion. Sort of reckless running down of creeds that he was engaged in the book. So when Pierre was published in 1852, first of all, his English publisher didn't like it the way it was written. Melville didn't want to change anything. It was never published in London, never published in England in his lifetime. I think some copies of the American edition ended up over there. But in America, it got terrible reviews. His friend Dykink, or maybe Dykink's brother George, wrote a panning review of it and said it was these characters are unbelievable. This was a terrible mistake. Melville is not pursuing the kind of writing he should be doing, which is, straightforward adventure. And so Melville, after this book, he really lost his ability to publish novel-length fiction, because this was his last novel for a few years. I mean,
So people thought he
turned
jumped the
to
shark
short.
on this one.
Yeah, well, he just got so much bad press, and people thought he was crazy, and he got very depressed at this point. He had some sciatica, which disabled him for a little while. And you know, in 1853, he was desperately trying to get an appointment to a consular position under the new administration of Franklin Pierce. You know, he thought he might have a job because his friend Hawthorne was Pierce's good buddy from Bowdoin College. You know, so Hawthorne was supposed to help Melville, but he really couldn't. He tried, but he really couldn't do very much. So Melville felt kind of stuck in Pittsfield, and you know, he only kept his career going by turning to magazine fiction. You know, he was offered the chance to write for Putnam's monthly magazine and Harper's monthly magazine, and that made him some money, but it wasn't really that much. So he wrote 2 more short novels. One of them was based on serial publication, Israel Potter. That was a story about the American Revolution, and then he wrote The Confidence Man, and after that, he was not publishing any fiction because he pretty much scared off his audience and aggravated his publishers. As his main publisher, of course, were the Harper brothers, and they were Methodists. You know, Harper's today, you know, they started out in the 1820s and 30s as the Harper brothers, and they came from a strong Methodist background. They published Methodist sermons and religious literature, and so they got a little bit upset after a while in dealing with Melville's work, because he just wasn't selling that much in the 1850s, and he got kind of a bad reputation because of his irreligion.
Well, had you and I been around, or had he been around here, things would have panned out a little bit differently. I guess he didn't need our help. I guess he found...
Pierre got championed in the 1950s and 60s. A guy named Henry Murray, who was a psychologist who taught at Harvard, became a big champion of the book. He edited a scholarly edition of the book with Hendrick's House, which is a series that's still very good. You can usually find a used copy of several of the Hendrick's House editions of Moby Dick and Pierre and some of the other novels. And so Henry A. Murray promoted Pierre in a very big way that kind of woke people up to its merits, starting in the late 1950s and 60s, and it's been getting more and more attention in the last 50 years that it never had.
Thank God for that.
Previous 150 years before, 100 years before that. So.
Well, and hopefully we have done our job to extend it to even a greater audience. I didn't even have a chance to look, but I can't imagine there's much in terms of audio and visual stuff on Melville's Pierre out there. So we might have innovated. I do not know, but we might be the first ones to ever do this.
Maybe, but if you do go out and get read the book, there's a good Penguin edition. Of course, if you really want a good scholarly edition, you get the Hendrick's House edition, which you can buy online probably for $5 or $10 these days. Yeah. So you probably need an annotated edition to explain some of the older allusions and classical or biblical terminology.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Cook. And I want you, I'm in the broadcast here, but I want you to stay on the line so we can plan what we do next. And
okay.
I just love this book, and I love hearing you explain it.
Good. Okay.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and thank you, Dr. Cook.
Yeah.